Hey guys, so today I was watching a documentary called Patriarchy. Yeah, Patriarchy, and it's essentially about the partisan split in the United States and how we have this two-party system that can't agree on anything and is constantly fighting with each other and how it's stopping progress. Um, and in it, there were some scenes where it would have a citizen talking to a member of Congress, and they'd end up saying that's unconstitutional. And they constantly bring up the that's unconstitutional. And if you're an American citizen, you probably know that the whole unconstitutional thing gets brought up all the time in public discourse. And you know what? It pisses me off. Because a lot of the times when people say that's unconstitutional, it's actually not. Um, so, what I thought I would do is instead of bitching about this, which I thought about doing, I'm going to do a little informational vlog where I'm going to explain to you the history of the US Constitution, some key misconceptions and some key points in the ruling of the Constitution, and explain all 27 amendments very concisely because I don't want this to be a 20-minute video. So, starting off with the history, the Continental Congress, which was our first governing system, in 1776 decided to start the Articles of Confederation, which was the predecessor of the Constitution. Now, the Articles of Confederation were problematic for a lot of reasons, but the reason they were so problematic is because we were coming right off of the war. In fact, when this was started in 1776, we would still be in the war for 5 more years, and we wouldn't even be finished with the peace treaty for another 8 years, because the peace treaty wasn't completely ratified by both the US and the British colonies. I mean, not the British colonies. The what is the word I'm looking for here? British Empire. And the British Empire until 1984. I mean, 1984. 1784. So, obviously, we were still part of the war. We were still in the war. We were still part of Britain at the time when the Articles of Confederation were drafted, and the one thing we did not want was to create a system that was essentially exactly like what the British were doing, which was ruling without representation and ruling with an iron fist. So what they decided to do was build a constitution that was basically as limited as possible. They didn't want any government interference with public life. They didn't want a lot of rules. They didn't want a heavy governing body. And because of this, we ended up with a pretty shit piece of work. The Articles of Confederation were very loose, and one of the big problems was that it gave the government no power to tax the people, so it had no revenue. And in order to pass an amendment to the Articles of Confederation, it had to be ratified by all the states. Now, this is obviously a reason because all the states never agree on shit. So, in order to get them all agree is pretty much impossible. There were a couple other issues with it, a couple things that there was no power to do, but these were probably the two things that were the most problematic. Was the fact that they couldn't make any revenue and they couldn't change any of their problems. So they figured out pretty quickly that this was a bad idea. The Articles of Confederation lasted less than a decade, and they were officially ratified in 1781, which was right at the end of the war. The end of the fighting, Cornwallis's defeat at Yorktown, was in, I believe it was October of 1781. I could be wrong on the month, but it was 1781. And so that was when the Articles of Confederation went into play. In 1789 was when the Constitution was ratified. Let me check that really quick, because I feel like I may have messed that up, and I don't want to mislead you. Oh, I was wrong. 1788. So good thing I checked that out. So as you can see, only lasted 7 years. Not very good. Once they had figured out that it was bad, they decided to go back to the drawing board and start a completely new system, which was what we now know as the Constitution. But prior to the Constitution, we had a thing called the Federalist Papers, which I actually have a copy of right here. So let me get that for you. Once again, I have decided to not edit my videos. This is the Federalist Papers. It's written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. It's a series of essays and letters. They're all under false names. Like, Madison is known as Publius, and can't remember what Hamilton was. Jay only appears a couple times. But the Federalists were one political branch of thought at the time, and the Anti-Federalists were the other. Federalists were for a strong central government. Anti-Federalists were for a weak central government. The Anti-Federalists were the backers of the Articles of Confederation. The Federalists were the backers of the Constitution. And so the ideas that are laid out in the Federalist Papers are a lot of the ideas that actually went into the Constitution, considering these are the same people that wrote the Constitution. James Madison was the official drafter of the United States Constitution. And the Articles of Confederation, incidentally, are what prompted for the Bill of Rights, because the Federalists didn't believe that we needed a Bill of Rights. They thought that the rights were inherent in the Constitution, that they didn't need to be elaborated on and put into words. And the Anti-Federalists were like, no, we don't trust the government to uphold that. We want it written in stone. So that's why we have the Bill of Rights today, interestingly enough. So the Constitution was ratified in 1788, and it had a couple new provisions that made the government a lot easier, one of them being that the government could actually excise taxes, and they, in order to amend it, you only needed 3/4 of the states. There's actually a complicated process to amending the Constitution. There's 3 different ways you can do it. It depends on a different number of votes in the House and the Senate. It's a complicated matter. Essentially, I'm just going to put a blanket statement out there, which is not 100% correct, but for those of you who don't want a long explanation on the 3 ways that you can amend the Constitution, you need 3/4 of the states to ratify it. End of discussion. 3/4? Obviously still difficult, which is why we only have 27 amendments to this day, but it's easier than 100% ratification. So, some common misconceptions about the Constitution. Side note, I'm not going to explain the whole Constitution because it's mother long. Actually, it's not actually that long compared to a lot of similar governing systems, but still there's a lot to cover. Maybe I'll do that in another video. Some common misconceptions is that everything that is in the Constitution is explicitly what the federal government cannot do. So this is something that comes up a lot because of the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment is that any powers not explicitly granted to the federal government in the Constitution are therefore given to the state and the people. However, there is a little catch with this that you can go around, and this is known as the Elastic Clause, also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause, which essentially says that anything that the federal government, that Congress deems necessary and proper can be done by the federal government. So if what you're thinking is, doesn't that essentially give federal government power to do just about anything? Yes, it does. It essentially does, really. And this is something that has been fairly controversial, and it's one of those things a lot of people don't understand. So if you're calling unconstitutional, I would first check to see if it's actually whatever this person is doing that you think is unconstitutional, if it's actually explicitly stated in the Constitution, and if so, if it's actually being broken. If so, it may be unconstitutional. However, if it's not explicitly stated, and it doesn't go against any of these sort of like implied rules, it's probably covered by the Necessary and Proper Clause. So it essentially gives the government power to do anything it deems necessary and proper, which in conjunction with the Commerce Clause, which is another thing that a lot of people don't know about, the Commerce Clause gives the federal government the ability to regulate interstate commerce as well as foreign commerce, not the commerce of other countries, but the commerce between other countries in the U.S. And the conjunction of these 2 clauses is what a lot of our laws have come around because of. Like the New Deal in the 30s, a lot of those programs came about because of these two clauses. Again, a lot of people then didn't think that the government had the power to, but it turns out they actually did. And it's because of these clauses that they did. And I'm pretty sure I just repeated myself like 30 times there. So anyway, those are two big provisions I think everyone needs to know about, because they are clauses that really allow the government to have a lot more power than you might think the government has. The rest of the Constitution essentially lays out our governing bodies. There's a section on the executive, a section on the legislative branch, and a section on the judicial branch. There's some other information in there. Maybe I'll cover this in another video, but as for right now, I'm going to skip to the amendments and explain to you what each is. So we have the First Amendment, which pretty much everyone knows about. It's the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, also freedom from religion, and freedom of the press. Freedom of speech and the press do have a couple little things, a couple little exceptions, which are very complicated, so I could actually make a whole video just on the First Amendment and the intricacies of it, but essentially it does give you these freedoms. You can't be jailed for writing something in the press. You can't be jailed for saying something. There are certain things like threatening the president's life doesn't really fall under the freedom of speech. You can have legal action taken after you for those kind of threats. Threats against people's lives in general can have legal repercussions. You can't yell fire in a crowded building. You do not have that freedom. But if you're saying, like, I don't like the president, you're perfectly capable of saying that. You're not going to get in trouble for that. They can't legally get you in trouble for that. So obviously in cases where people are endangered by the things you say, there are some specifications. But in general, freedom of speech, freedom from religion, also implied is freedom of religion. Within there is freedom from religion, that the state cannot have an official religion. It cannot support a religion. It's essentially the basis of a secular state. Okay, moving on. Second Amendment is another one everyone knows, right to bear arms, which there's some controversy with this one too, because the way it's worded it involves a well-regulated militia. A militia is a I just forgot what I was saying. It's essentially a military of the people. It's not like official soldiers sort of thing. It's more like everyday people. And so there's some wonder over if that's what they meant. There was, I think, a court case that interpreted that that's not the meaning. Still, in my opinion, I don't think that the founding fathers, when they wrote that they, by the way, I like to call them the founders, not the founding fathers, because I think fathers is a bit patriarchal. But anyway, the founders, when they wrote that, I don't think they were really expecting the modern weapons we have, like semi-automatic rifles and handguns. I mean, they were talking about like muskets. So, but let's not get into that because that's a whole different discussion. Essentially, you have the right to buy a gun. Not just a gun, really anything. You have the right to arm yourself and protection. Okay, Third Amendment is something that doesn't get talked about a lot, but because of fairly obvious reasons. It's the right to not have troops quartered in your house. This is actually a problem about the time of the Revolutionary War, when they would have troops forcibly quartered in people's homes, and they'd have to watch over these troops even if they didn't support them. So that's a big problem. Actually, incidentally, this is still used in modern day, where in cases like Hurricane Katrina and stuff, the army couldn't stay certain places in a city, but the National Guard could, because the National Guard is actually part of the state, not the federal army. The more you know. Fourth Amendment is another one of those that a lot of people are like, what? Because really beyond the first two, not a lot of people know about them. But the fourth prohibits search and seizures, so the police can't just come into your house without a warrant and be like, I'm taking all your shit. So can't do that. It requires there to be warrants and probable cause, so there actually has to be some evidence that you committed a crime before they can take your shit. The Fifth Amendment is essentially protecting you from self-incrimination. You cannot testify against yourself in court. Double jeopardy. You cannot be tried for the same crime twice, and you have due process of law, which is essentially they have to follow the law, and you have the right to certain laws, like the due process. The sixth is essentially right to a fair and speedy trial by your peers. Speedy is a pretty liberal term considering a lot of U.S. court cases take years. An average rape case takes about a year, so that deters a lot of people, which is another controversial thing, is it really speedy? But you do have the right to a trial by your peers, and a public trial. You have the right to know who is accusing you. You have the right to confront who's accusing you, and you have the right to get legal counsel. Essentially, you have the right to hire a lawyer. Oh my god, sorry. My nose is really itchy. Okay, the seventh is that you have a right to a trial by jury in a civil case. A civil case is not like murder or something. A civil case is a lawsuit where you have two parties which are suing the other because of money reasons, essentially. If you think that somebody owes you money, if you think that a business has wronged you, these are like civil cases. Kind of stuff you see on Judge Judy. Well, I mean, it can be bigger than that, but that's a pretty simplified version of a civil case. Eighth is prohibits against excessive fines and bail. So essentially, you cannot be, you can't have a bail of $5 million for stealing a stereo from Walmart. This also stops cruel and unusual punishment. The ninth protects rights that are not in the Constitution. So just because it's not in the Constitution doesn't mean you don't have that right. That's a pretty blanket statement, and it's complicated, but in general, just because they didn't specifically enumerate your right doesn't mean that you don't have that right. It's one of those things that they came up with where they're like, guys, we can only write so much stuff. This is one body of work. We can't cover absolutely everything. So one of those blanket statements. And then the 10th, sorry, something popped up on my window. The 10th limits the powers of federal government, essentially saying that, like I said before, any power not given to the federal government is given to the states and the people. Now, once you get past the 10, and the first 10 are called the Bill of Rights, that's pretty much where people's knowledge of these start to wane. I mean, there's a lot of people who don't know any other amendments besides the first 10, except for maybe the 20th and the 18th, and the 13th. So, and the 15th. Anyway, I'm just going to get to the rest, and since this video is almost 20 minutes long, I'm going to try to make it as fast as I can. Okay, so the 11th is essentially you can't start a court case with another state. Like, I can't just bring up a case against the state of Pennsylvania because I'm from Utah. Also, someone from England can't do a case against a U.S. state. So that's a problem. The 12th revises the electoral procedure, and okay, this is one of my favorite amendments because I think the reason for it is really, really funny. So what happened in 1796 was that when you voted for president, not everyone could vote at this time, by the way, but when Congress and the Electoral College would vote for the president, they would cast two votes, and the person with the most votes would become president, and the person who would get the second most votes would become, they would cast one vote, not two votes, sorry. The person who got the most votes would be president, the person who got the second most votes would be vice president. Problematic? Obviously. When this happened in 1796, John Adams became president, and Thomas Jefferson became vice president. Adams was a Federalist, and Jefferson was a Democratic Republican, or is it Republican Democrat? I think it's Democratic Republican. Anyway, that's essentially the modern day equivalent of Obama being president and Romney being vice president. Obviously problematic. So they amended this so that you vote, so that the Electoral College votes for the president and the vice president separately, so you don't have that same problem. Okay, 13th Amendment abolished slavery. 14th Amendment was the Equal Protection Clause, so essentially stopped legal discrimination against people based on color and sex stuff. Obviously, we had the Equal Rights Amendment later on. I mean, not the Equal Rights Amendment, that never got passed. The Civil Rights. But this essentially was that you couldn't deny legal rights to people based on their race. That's a very general thing, and it doesn't just apply to race, and I'm not explaining this very well. That's a general gist of the idea. 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote. Not specifically blacks, it really gave all people of all races, all people of color, the right to vote. Still not women, though. 16th Amendment allowed the government to take income tax. Before this, we actually couldn't do income tax. The more you know. The 17th Amendment was for the U.S. senators to be directly elected by the people. Before this, the state Senate actually would elect senators. I mean, state Congress would elect senators. So the people actually had no choice over who their senators were, which is kind of stupid. 18th was Prohibition, so eliminated the sale and purchase of alcohol. 19th Amendment was women's suffrage. Woo! Women got the right to vote, which is good. The 20th was pretty boring. It just dictates when the president and Congress go into office, which for Congress is January 3rd, and the president is January 20th. The 21st Amendment got rid of the 18th Amendment, so it got rid of Prohibition because people decided that they really like to drink. 22nd Amendment determined the number of terms a president can have to just 2. Before this, we actually had Roosevelt, who was president for, second Roosevelt, FDR, not Teddy, who was president for 3 terms. Before this, there was no term limit, but now we have a term limit. The 23rd Amendment gives Washington, D.C. 1 electoral vote, which, strangely enough, before this happened, if you lived in Washington, D.C., you didn't really get a vote for president. There was no electoral college. Strange. 24th eliminated poll taxes, so you cannot tax people in order to vote. That's not fair, and that also discriminates people based on income, which in a lot of ways was a form of racial discrimination. 25th Amendment defines presidential succession. So when the president dies, who becomes president? It's vice president. If the vice president dies, the Speaker of the House becomes president. If the Speaker of the House dies, the President of the Senate pro tempore, I think is what it's called, becomes president. And from then on, it goes with like the different departments, and it goes on for a long list. There's 16 people on this list. So, yeah, it's this line of succession for president. 26th Amendment gives people age 18 or over the right to vote. Oddly enough, when my dad was 18, he couldn't vote because this didn't go into action until 1970, and my dad turned 18 in 1968. And then the 27th Amendment, and the very last one, the last one we have had, makes it so that Congress cannot determine their own salary while they're in office. You may think that this is very odd, and it is, but before this, Congress could determine their salary while they were still in office, and yes, for you non-Americans, you're hearing that right, Congress does determine its own salary. They get to decide how much money they make, which I think is very strange, but that's the way things are. But now they cannot do it while they're in office, so they can change the salary for the next term, but not the current term. So this has been an extraordinarily long video, and I'm done, and I hope you enjoyed your mini history lesson. Bye.